This week, Andy Jaquith joins us to discuss how to prioritize vulnerabilities and remediation in the real world, including asset management and more. In the security news, ESP32 is in the wild in security, a Google oAuth flaw that Google refuses to fix, DDoS targets, a ban on automotive components, Bambu firmware updates are causing a stir, Silk Road founder is free, one last cybersecurity executive order, U.S. Treasury hack update, Mitre launches a new program to deal with naming things, and educational content on Pornhub. It's not what you think. It's actually safe for work. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Paul's Security Weekly is supported by Bitwarden, the trusted solution for password, passkey, and secrets management. Bitwarden empowers everyone to create and manage strong and unique credentials across all accounts and devices. With enterprise SSO integration, end-to-end encryption, and secure autofill capabilities, Bitwarden defends against phishing attacks and data breaches. Strengthen your security posture with tools built to protect what matters most. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Bitwarden. IT professionals, mark your calendars. Zero Trust World 2025 is happening in Orlando, Florida, February 19th to the 21st. This event is tailored for IT leaders and cybersecurity experts who want actionable insights on zero trust strategies, practical solutions for modern threats, and meaningful connections with industry peers. Plus, take advantage of hands-on cyber hero boot camps, expert-led sessions, and the chance to earn CPE credits and your cyber hero certificate. Save $200 on your in-person registration using discount code ZTWSW25 at securityweekly.com/ZTW2025. Reserve your spot now. Quick question: do your end users always, and I mean always, without exception, work on company-owned devices and IT-approved apps? I didn't think so. So my next question is, how do you keep your company's data safe when it's sitting on all those unmanaged apps and devices? 1Password has an answer to this question: Extended Access Management. 1Password Extended Access Management helps you secure every sign-in for every app on every device because it solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. Check it out at securityweekly.com/1Password. ThreatLocker implements a least privilege approach to cybersecurity, blocking every executable unless specifically authorized by your team. This methodology mitigates ransomware, supply chain attacks, and zero-day exploits and ensures protection for your organization 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. To learn more about how ThreatLocker can help prevent known and unknown threats in your digital environment, safeguard your data and operations from threat actors, and align your organization with respected compliance frameworks, visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker. Coming to you from Purgatory Studios in semi-high definition, compliments of Darth Vader himself, this is Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode number 858, being recorded on Thursday, January 23rd, 2025. It's actually Wednesday, January 22nd, but it'll air on Thursday, January 23rd. I'm Paul Asadorian, joined by Mr. Josh Marpet. Josh, welcome.
Thank you. I'm eager to have this chat about risk quantification. Really?
Yes, me too. Mr. Sam Bound is here with us. Sam, welcome.
Good evening. Glad to be here.
Miss Mandy Logan is with us. Mandy, welcome.
Why, thank you. And I'm wearing a scarf in homage to the snowpocalypse in the South.
There you go. Nice scarf. Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us. Jeff, welcome.
There's no way we're not having this discussion without that ugly 3-letter thing coming up.
It's got to bring it up every show. It's a requirement. A quick announcement before we dive into it. Security Weekly listeners can save $100 on their RSA Conference 2025 full conference pass. The RSA Conference will take place April 28th through May 1st in San Francisco and on demand. To register using the discount code, please visit securityweekly.com/RSAC25. Use the code 5U5SecWeekly. We hope to see you there. We're excited to welcome Andy Jaquith, Managing Director from Marker Bench, with us today. Andy is the 25-year career as a CISO executive and cyber practitioner that spans startups to successful exits, working for Fortune 100s, global financial firms, and more. He is also one of the co-founders of At Stake. We might do some reminiscing at the top of the segment, a pioneering cybersecurity consultancy, of course. Andrew wrote the book on security metrics called Security Metrics, Replacing Fear, Uncertainty, and Doubt, which is used by a generation of risk professionals to connect security to the corner office. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. I feel like I'm on Hollywood Squares. This is
That's
a
right.
first-time caller. We've got Paul Lynn, Sammy Davis Jr., and a number of other celebrities, so it's good to be among you.
That's it. Andy, how'd you get your start in information security?
Totally by accident. I've been, I started programming when I was 10, so I had that tech thing going. I had a economics and political science degree as an undergraduate, thoroughly useless. So I decided to do what I knew, which was to write code, and eventually I wound my way through a bunch of different IT-related jobs, network management, and so on, until a boss that I had when I was at Cambridge Technology Partners tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, you want to do a startup?" And this was 1999, and everybody was getting their ticket punched to be a millionaire, and I thought, I'd like my ticket punched to be a millionaire. Thank you very much. What's the startup do? And he said, security. I said, security? I don't know anything about that. He's like, don't worry about it. You'll learn. And so I came over, and little did I know, but it was a venture-backed startup, Battery Ventures. They had an investment thesis. They had $10 million of cash, which seemed like a lot at the time, and we wound up combining with the Loft and recruiting a bunch of other folks, and the rest is history. Like the who's who gallery is incredible, including
Right.
the Loft folks.
What was the startup? What was the startup name?
It was At Stake.
So you were At Stake, and then you At Stake was like a conglomeration at the very beginning, right?
Yeah, it was. But it had, like Dan Gear, for example, had the email address burned At Stake, because that's how he rolls. We'd Mudge, Weld, Dill, Space
Wasn't he
Rogue.
an advisor at the very beginning, Dan Gear?
He was
was the
CTO.
officer?
He was the founding
CTO.
CTO, and then he got defenestrated over the somewhat infamous Microsoft white paper with Bruce Schneier and a bunch of others. So, but there was it was awesome time and very formative, and I learned a bunch of stuff there. And just
out of the window.
I went corporate and more or less, and wound my way through a number of different roles, and more recently into the banking space, which is where my day job is. So.
And your day job is as a CISO, correct?
Yeah, I am the U.S. CISO for Scotiabank U.S., and that's a subsidiary of Canadian Bank, one of the top 3 banks in Canada. 100,000 people, big attack surface, client, institutional business, consumer business in Canada. So great place to be.
No PCI story there. Let's move on.
They don't have a card business, Jeff. Stop it.
Well, the U.S. doesn't. So.
I have so many questions, right? Because I often wonder, because I don't do the Einstein like Josh does anymore, so I don't get to talk to folks that work for large corporation. You say 100,000 people?
Yep.
And so, like, what's your technology footprint look like?
Well, I can't say too much about the bank and what we do, but like a lot of places, especially most large institutions, they're very few. Like Goldman, where I was for a bit, they kind of were totally organic, but most of the others grow through acquisition of some kind, and so you get cats and dogs, a little bit of everything. 10 flavors of database. Lots of different network gear, tons of different application platforms. If you're lucky, you kind of get monolithic in your stack. If you're not lucky, you get
But at least 100,000, probably
if you're
100,000
a startup,
Windows.
you get Dan Gear. If you're an enterprise, you get a mixed mishmash of corporate gear.
Totally.
Network gear.
But you have like 100,000 Windows endpoints.
I don't know if that's exactly right, but I'm not going to comment on the.
He can
on the
neither
level of
confirm
statement.
nor
Lots of
deny.
Windows
Paul,
and-
move
Right.
on. Move
Lots
on,
of
Paul.
Windows. Yeah. So, but I was trying to segue into, we talk a lot on the show. New vulnerability is released, maybe accompanied by an exploit, maybe accompanied by drama. There's, the vulnerability of the week, several of the week are really interesting to cover in that what is our response. So protecting the large enterprise that you work for, Andy, what's your high-level approach to monitoring the threat landscape and then taking that information and applying it in a practical sense to your organization?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll kind of talk about this generally, right? I mean, like way back in the day, we started with CVSS, which was, I think, a pretty well-meaning and reasonable effort to try and categorize severity of vulnerabilities: what's critical, what's high, what's medium, what's low. All the vendors kind of aligned with it more or less. Microsoft, Cisco, Oracle, and so on. And it was a reasonable first pass. The problem is that a lot of the vulnerabilities, you essentially have grade inflation where you have tons and tons of criticals, tons and tons of highs, and so you end up with this flood of stuff, some of which are weaponized and some of which are not, right? So you've got, and I should give some credit on this. There have been a number of startups that have gone after this problem, but how do you take a real risk-based approach to vulnerability? So step one is, okay, what does it say on the tin? What does the manufacturer say about this vulnerability? Is it remotely exploitable? Is it, and you, as they say on the internet, you do your own research to try and figure out how serious this thing is. Is it weaponized? Do you have, so it's almost any of these fast moving ones, you almost always look at a threat source, like a Flashpoint or a number of other threat networks that you have to just see what kind of chatter is out there. And then based on that, the next question you have is, okay, if this thing is a fast moving one, it's time to scramble. Right. And so at least the way I divide up the world, most of the time you've got an SLA chart that says, okay, for anything that's internet facing critical, our clock is X. If it's high risk and internal, it's Y. And there's a prioritization that you go through, regardless of what the vuln is classified as. But the ones that are really where it's a live one and you have a lot of exploitation going on, it's a scramble, right? And so it's an all hands on deck. And this is never mind what the SLA says. This isn't fix it now. This is fix it right now, right? And that's a hard thing to orchestrate, especially when you have a big application estate. I'll kind of roll back the clock a little bit. When shadow brokers came out a bunch of years ago, I was at another venue on another network, as they say, and we had to make a decision. It was Easter weekend, and the vulns came out on like a Friday or a Thursday or something. And
it's always a Friday when
and we had to really quickly. It completely ruined my Easter weekend. Was to say, okay, what is our actual external estate on Eternal Blue and all these others?
Yep.
What do we have, and are we up to patch? And if not, is there I think that one had a bunch of emergency patches, right? So how quickly do you move it? And that was a get everybody out of bed and patch their stuff kind of day. And for an institution where rule number one is it's working fine, don't touch it, right? Then it takes a lot of doing, and it's a lot of escalation, and it sort of goes rockets all the way up, and then it's got to come all the way down to all the IT units so they can get their work done. So that's what a scramble looks like. The run-of-the-mill stuff is frankly a little more metronome-like, which is, okay, it's Friday, it's time to make the donuts. Right, time to roll the patches. What's our change window? Let's do it, and then you measure afterwards to see what stuck, what didn't take. And on the client sides, most organizations have gone through this maturity curve where you push your patches, but not all of it takes, particularly on the workstations, because people are on vacation. People put a laptop under a desk, or they don't reboot their machines. Which is the big thing with Windows patches. Unless and until you reboot your machines, it ain't patched. So the other part, and this was one institution I was at, every Friday night, 6:00. It didn't matter whether you were the CEO or the lowest level associate. Your PC was getting rebooted at 7 p.m. Right, and that's just the way it worked. And most organizations have had to tolerate some operational breakage in order to get these things to stick. So long-winded answer, but hopefully that gives you a good sense.
No, but I like that last part is you have to withstand some operational breakage in order to move forward in remediating vulnerabilities to ultimately reduce risk.
Yep.
And that's kind of a refreshing take. I think oftentimes you hear people say, well, we don't tolerate any operational breakage that's self-inflicted from patches, but you have to. You're right. And in this day and age, you have to.
Yep. But I think that's a function of the size of the organization, and it's, I hate to use a buzzword, it's resilience, at being able to
That's not a
absorb
buzzword. That's reality.
the
I'm sorry.
breakage.
Resilience is importance.
It is. I don't think I'm saying anything especially out of school, but prior to my current role, I was CISO at a pretty large law firm, and I'm not going to comment on that particular law firm other than to say that as a species, lawyers have terrible OPSEC, right?
Yeah.
Fairly terrible. My mother-in-law's a lawyer, right? It's like password on a sticky note kind of terrible OPSEC.
That's a double whammy right there.
Yeah, I know, but she's wonderful.
Here's
And
to mother-in-law.
but part of it, we had to go up that maturity curve and to say we are rebooting your machines, right? And
Yeah.
it's going to happen every X number of days or weeks, and we'll do it we'll work around your schedules. We know you're going to work on a Saturday, so fine, right? So we'll time this so it detonates at whatever hour it is, Sunday 1 p.m.
3
something
a.m.
like that, right?
Yeah.
On a practical level, though, Windows is a lot better at auto saving these days than in the
True.
early days.
Yeah.
So it's not quite as painful.
Yeah, most of your stuff is in the cloud, not really working locally, although there are many exceptions to that. But
Yep.
largely, I feel like your documents are in the cloud.
Andy, I want to. We started off by saying that we would talk about risk in terms of vulnerabilities. I really want to drill a little bit into the risk-based approach, because CVSS was great at this point. Excuse me, I'm still sick. That's why I sound like I'm gargling frogs. Forgive me. But it's score inflation, I think you'd called it, which is correct. And I'm going to quote The Incredibles: "When everybody is special, nobody is." Okay, I use that quote a lot, weirdly enough.
I love that.
But the thing is that the risk-based approach is tough for people to implement. I really want to get your advice. How do companies implement a risk-based approach around vulnerabilities?
It's interesting on this, right? There's been a couple of there have been some proprietary stuff. One that I've become a little more familiar with recently is Tenable's VPR, right? Rest in peace, Amit, by the way. So miss that guy. But and there are some other, the Qualys has a similar type thing. All the vendors have sort of added these, and that's a good thing. It gives you a sense of whether it's been weaponized, and I take that stuff pretty seriously, because if something is a 9.0 on a Tenable VPR, like, that tells me a lot, right?
But they're adding
so that's a piece
So
of it.
Andy, I'm
delivery
going
point?
to just hone in on the VPR.
Yeah.
They're incorporating some threat intelligence into that, then raising the score if it's been observed exploitable.
That's right.
In the wild, which there's multiple tiers to exploitable in the wild.
Yep.
We wouldn't necessarily have to get into
Yep.
that, right? But if there are observables that it's actually being used or something exists to exploit it, that raises the score.
Yep. That's thank you. That's exactly it. And so we do take that into account, and it informs how quickly we move.
Yeah, no, that's. I think at that scale, that's super important, right?
Yep.
Because you can't move quickly on everything in an environment that large. And I think oftentimes we sit here as pundits and we're like, well, everyone should just patch everything all the time, and that'll fix everything. Not really getting from your perspective, right? Having an organization that large, you physically just can't do that.
It's hard, although the good news is a lot of the update processes scale pretty well, right? So
Yeah.
And the client side in many ways is actually the easier part of the problem, because
Yeah, I agree.
You can push the updates out. You time it for whatever local time zone if you're operating multinationally, and you kind of work it, and eventually, Josh, to your point earlier, people get resilient about this, right? They learn. People are learning animals, right? They learn that
The
Friday
good ones
night.
are learning animals.
Fair. Right, fair. But many people sort of figure that sure enough, it's gonna happen. So I got to save my work, or the timer says I get 10 minutes, so I guess I got to get things finished. But the harder part is actually typically the server estate, because you've got lots of problems there. So part of it is
greater operational risk on the server side, Andy, than the client desktop side. Because I feel my other question there was like, do you find that their operational, what do I want to say, like operational mishaps, if you will, are less on the client side endpoint than they are on the server side, right? And has that gotten better over time, or is that something you measure?
I think so. I mean, I'd say I have a hard time kind of quantifying exactly, but
Mhm.
on the server side, what you're really looking at is operational risk
Mm,
because something got weaponized and it caused a server that's supporting a critical business process to go sideways. On the client side, you're more worried about like ransomware style attacks where somebody gets a
mhm.
foothold and they're able to move laterally and escalate privilege and then get DA, which is the fundamental goals. Um,
Right.
a lot of the servers tend to be they're either minimally connected or at least they're a little less connected to the domain structure. And so the contagion risk is tends to be less depending on the company, depending on how they do it. Um,
Right.
but the crater's
Well,
bigger, right? Most operational
yes.
outages are way more expensive than any particular cyber outage, like by an order of
Right.
magnitude.
Sure. Sure. Do you find that third party, so when we're talking about Windows environments on the endpoint side, that third party software pretty safe to update? I feel like I take browser updates and like it doesn't impact my life.
Yeah. The plugins and the Adobe stuff tends to frustrate. Java is a
Mm-hmm.
pest, especially with lots and lots of versions. And
Mm.
God forbid you have it on the desktop. Um,
Which you
Flash,
still
God
do,
forbid.
right? Like
Yeah.
the financial organization you work for has been in business for how many years, and it has legacy applications that trickle their way down on the desktop. That's
Everybody does.
Mainframe.
yeah.
Mainframe.
Everybody is mainframe. Yeah. Although I'm
Mm-hmm.
not that worried about
Yeah,
mainframe compromise to be fair. But
I know, but it's just fun to say.
yeah, it is fun. It is fun. Yeah, yeah. So it's but I think to the point, the third party stuff tends to be a little easier to deal with. Like for browsers, again, this is sort of past experience. In a prior life, we would have an IT team that would sort of centrally examine all of the browser patches, right? And they would say, "Oh, is it safe to release?" Because there was a concern about operational breakage. And think
Mm-hmm.
back to the days where you had lots of ActiveX controls. Again, heaven forbid.
Yeah. Right.
And so browser stability was super important. And so we have that kind of legacy of like extra checking. But what the way we sold it was we said, look, we got two browsers. We have Edge and we have Chrome.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Slam the updates down as fast as they come. And if one browser is broken, they can use the other one.
Use the other, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So
So there's a backup plan built in. I like that. I want to go back to the mainframe. Why doesn't the mainframe environment concern you as much, Andy? Is it because it's not being targeted as much as attackers, or is it just more tightly controlled environment, or both?
um, it tends to be better controlled, right? You do
Mm,
a lot of batch processing on the mainframes. You don't have the same kind of you do have privileged accounts, but it's not quite the same. Backup regimes tend to be excellent in the mainframe world as well.
Well,
So
I think
yeah,
AAA and RBAC it pretty much like started on the mainframe
yeah,
platform, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's a great point.
As
And
the
it's a rarer skill, to be honest.
applications.
Well,
Yeah, I agree. We don't.
and
I don't
there's
cover a lot of news where people are breaking into mainframes. True.
there's less functionality on the mainframe, less features, and those all this new
Sports.
technology and newfangled features tend to
true,
be the
Jeff.
things that get exploited to this day. In the,
Yeah.
Black F for life. Anyway,
having hacked a mainframe, once I was on it, I had no idea what to do. So,
Mm,
that was 20 years ago. But
How do
yeah,
I write this buffer overflow in FSDIC? I'd like to know.
right.
exactly.
I told a story on the show before, but I once thought that the Telnet communications were encrypted, that they're using some encryption protocol. Turns out it was just EBCDIC. I was like, oh, no, I got it. Okay.
seriously, that's so funny.
Yeah, when I first started at the university
Are you
and
serious?
I implemented the first intrusion detection system, it was sniffing, points in the network. And yeah, I was like, what is this encrypted channel to the mainframe that is going over port 23?
Well,
Mhm.
I
And it was
mean,
because whatever like software I was using at the time I didn't have the plugins loaded that would understand that format.
it is effectively encrypted. It's a Caesar cipher, right?
Yeah, right.
Oh, that's bad.
Andy, I want to ask you about
Not 13
assets
twice.
really quick. Like I think a great leading question is, what is an asset, right? And this is important because in order to respond, you got to know what you have in order to respond to it.
Yeah.
And then you have to say, well, what is an asset? Is it a person? Is it a place, a thing, a component? What?
Yeah, expansively speaking, it is all the things you described, right? So,
Yeah.
like, I refer to high value targets, right? People in the bank, typically high ranks like managing directors, VPs, SVPs, and so on,
Mhm.
partners, whatever, depending on where you are. Those are all high value targets, and there are human assets in that respect. But from a technology asset standpoint, it starts, applications is typically the largest grained container of asset, and and what most assets have is they have somebody who owns it. They have a unique identifier of some kind, and often dependencies with other assets. So and if you think about this, like with a configuration management database, like a ServiceNow CMDB platform,
Mm-hmm.
you have these things. They're called configuration items, but they're essentially asset classes, right? Not mortgage-backed security asset classes or anything, but
Yeah.
like server or workstation or network switch, and with different subclasses underneath it, or load balancer and things like that. And so when you look at a CMDB, part of what you want to do is make sure that typically everything that has an IP address or could be uniquely managed, like an application which doesn't have an IP, but you could trace it back to servers that that it contains or it depends on. Really, the CMDB is a way to relate all these things together, but it's also a list of them as well. So, the hard part, most organizations have challenges with their technology asset management system of some kind, because it goes stale, isn't well integrated, and so on. And
It's
that's
never 100%.
never
I find
100%.
people frustrated by that, right? Like, we're kind of technology nerds, and
Yeah.
we like to reach that 100% goal. And if there's something missing, it really bugs us. But when it comes to CMDBs, you're never 100%, right? It's a rolling number.
No, you can't be 100%. I mean, the way I treat it, I think of CMDB as a model, right? So it's the model of what you think the organization is, and the technology assets that you believe the organization contains. What you actually find is essentially the training set. And
Mhm.
so everything that Tenable or Qualys might find, auto discovery tool of some kind, SNMP MIBs, whatever, like they're just going out finding stuff for you, right? So when you compare those things that you found with what's in the CMDB, you can compute an accuracy number. It's sort of,
Mhm.
it's almost like a data science confusion matrix.
Right.
And it's a Venn diagram. It's the stuff that's in the CMDB that you also discovered. That's good. That's what you want. You want the things you discover to match what's in your CMDB. If you discover something that you don't see in the CMDB, that's essentially a false negative, right? If you see something that is in the CMDB that you didn't discover or rediscover, then essentially it's a false positive, right? So it's a stale item, right? And then there are going to be things that are outside of that entirely, like what I would call network dark matter, stuff that you're not scanning for because whatever, you're blind to it or you can't scan it or something. And then and it's not in the CMDB either. Like, that's the stuff that I sweat about at night, which is, where's my
Mhm.
dark matter? What do I not see? What am I blind to? Where are my tools blind and that I don't know about?
I
And
love
it's,
that name.
yeah. So those are, but it's hard, right? And so, we try to measure, I try to measure it, try to compute an accuracy number for this. And mostly what I index for are the things that I find that aren't in the CMDB. I sort of don't care about the stale stuff. I do, but it's a hygiene problem. And so what I really care about is what didn't I know about that I just found, and then you sort of, it's like the Nazgul flying out of Mordor. Okay, whose is this? Who belongs to it? What business process does it roll up to? Is it patched? What operating? You start
Yeah,
going
that's
down the
the
10
harder thing,
questions.
is tying it back to an operational group, a
We
responsible
had
party.
I had
Right?
a guy I knew at a major computer vendor, and they had a process for this, which I swiped. It's called the host of interest process. It's sort of like person of interest,
Yeah.
but it's a host of interest. Like, I just saw a thing. I don't know what that thing is. We're gonna go look at it. And it's something that I've swiped as kind of a practitioner idea, but that's
Yeah,
part of
I've
this
been
whole
there.
asset
I've been
problem.
there. I'm like, what is that on the network? And then I'm like, Oh, and then it's like, okay, well, it's an investigation. We're like, well, who owns that? Right? There's an investigation that has to ensue.
Yeah.
And it's just an ongoing, continuous process.
That's it.
Can I ask a quick question?
Please do. You just did, but
Thank you.
And done.
Of our esteemed guest. At an enterprise level, present company excluded or not specifically, how much does the enterprise rely on, especially for like a Windows environment, the Patch Tuesday for discovery of vulnerabilities versus monitoring other sources?
It's a great question. I mean, I think you really have two, I'd say kind of two big sources for it typically, right? You've got your scanning tools, and they're as good as they are, right? And then you've got and you do have the Patch Tuesday, right? So Patch Tuesday in some ways is kind of like it's Microsoft's blessed source for things that they know that are bad, but that's not everything. And then there's all the vendor stuff. You got to stay on top of all the vendor announcements for the switches, the routers, everything else. The network gear is of particular concern these days because the bad guys are essentially dictating our capital replacement cycle at the edge.
it's been an interesting
Yeah.
trend, hasn't it?
Yeah. I don't know if that.
How
I don't know if
do
that
you
answers
how
your
do you
question,
deal?
Jeff, but it's
How do
you gotta pull
Well,
from
if
lots
I
of
may
different places.
follow up
Before
before
you
Paul
go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, sort of independent of the vulnerability scanners. I've been fighting for years in a certain compliance world that actually specifically says you need to have other sources for vulnerability information and not rely simply on scan results, with the idea being, the announcements are going to come out before even the signatures get updated or you get the download for your scanners. Plus you have to wait for whatever the next time your scan is happening type of thing. So I was just kind of curious, smaller companies much more reliant on the automated tools, but I sort of preach to the wind. Yeah, but you got to be doing better than that.
I'll give you case in point on this. Like, and this is where some of the threat intel sources become really helpful. So there were I don't know, a couple of years ago, one of the major appliance vendors, think load balancer, VPN, that sort of area, right? I don't want to give it away by giving you too much detail, but just to say that we heard a rumor that there was something, there was an exploit that had been weaponized and had been developed, and it turned out that we heard that rumor a month before the actual patch dropped, right? And when it dropped, we scrambled like hell to get it all out, and I think we patched everything in about 8 hours, which was pretty great. Right. But before that, we sort of said, well, what can we do, right? And so we looked at the estate and we looked at the set of these things, these devices that we had, and we tried to understand what the potential threat pathway was going to be, and not knowing what the vector was. And you got to try and you have to shoot in the dark a little bit sometimes, but sometimes those early threat warnings do give you, you really start to, this is like Adam Shostak's area, like threat analysis, really trying to model the threats. But it's hard. I do take your point. You got to look at a lot of different sources, and a lot of that stuff is not going to be available in the mainstream press. So you got to look hard.
Yeah, it's just interesting, Andy, that we treat network and security appliances, or it's a different landscape, and it's very different from your Windows endpoint. Our Windows endpoint, we know what we get from Microsoft. We have to harden it. We know we have to put on additional security software. We don't necessarily have those same things in those appliances, and that's a very frustrating point for me in our community, in our industry today, is that we don't have enough visibility. We don't have enough access into not just the threat intelligence and IOCs, but the platforms themselves to do what we do to protect our other assets in our environment, like our Windows PCs and servers.
Yep. I have a thesis on this, and I did a post on Markerbench called "Who Killed the Perimeter? Some Clues," right? And it basically takes the proposition that the bad guys are dictating how quickly we have to refresh our edge, and that that no edge devices are fundamentally safe. And the example I gave earlier a minute ago was we had, just a sort of post-mortem on that edge device case, we patched our stuff in about 6-8 hours, something like that. Not bad, right? Not
That's
bad.
pretty good. No, it's good. Yeah.
We saw the first probes 20 minutes after the patch dropped,
Wow.
which meant that it means that if you kind of take it to that conclusion, it means it doesn't really matter how fast you patch, especially those edge devices. You can't go fast enough. You just can't. And so you sort of have to give up and say, we're just going to get rid of them. Right.
Yeah.
So that to me is end game for the traditional perimeter. The bad guys have won. Stick a fork in it. We're done.
Right.
Let's just get rid of them as quickly as we can.
Yeah. We need more resilient systems. In short of that, you're going to go to something that is more resilient because they're hanging out there on the internet. That's their job is, the edge devices to hang out there on the internet. So,
Yep. So, I would hate to be Fortinet right now.
yeah, the list goes on. They're all, yep. We cover them every single week. I pay attention to that closely.
You're absolutely right.
So,
Well said.
Andy, I want to thank you so much for coming on Paul Security Weekly. It was wonderful having you. Great insights as to what it's like to run security for a large organization. So it was very refreshing.
Time flies. I feel like I could spend more time. Really,
absolutely.
Thanks for doing this. I was a guest.
Come back anytime. We'd love to have you part of the discussion.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Andy.
Have a good night.
Good night.
In the news this week, I think we should talk politics, but not talk politics because we've never talked politics on this show. And I don't care to talk politics. However, we don't just turn a blind eye to everything that's happening here in the U.S., specifically in the context of the political climate, executive orders that have been passed, memorandums that have been sent. There's been a lot of that that's come out. I think it's a good place to start. Given the administration change, certainly there's a lot to be written that we don't know how it'll pan out. But certainly some things have happened already. Jeff, you had a story about the outgoing administration, and this is not uncommon, right? I'm just saying, wherever your political views lie, we'll save that for another show. Save that for your Facebook comments or wherever you like to talk politics, right? But I'm just saying, doesn't matter your political preference or party preference. Outgoing organization, typically you'll see things set in motion just so that the other administration has to work harder to roll those things back, kind of thing. It's kind of like, I feel strongly about these things, so I'm going to push out whatever I can, and then the incoming administration is trying to undo all of that. And this back and forth. And I have to say, look, just to be frank, some of the stuff in either side, some of the stuff I agree with, the orders, and some of the stuff I don't, and I think we can do a lot better as a nation. With specifics to specifically in the realm of cybersecurity, the Biden administration, was it an executive order, right, on cybersecurity? Was it just one on cybersecurity or more than one?
Well, they released one back in, I think, 21.
Yeah, there was during the Biden administration, there were several executive orders that were cybersecurity and supply chain related.
Second one that at least major one. I mean, based on the article, I'm not an expert, but the article I think alluded to this was the second big one that they released sometime last week, Thursday or something like that, which seemed and it seemed to sweep up a lot of the topics that we talk about a lot on the show. And I think the executive order was essentially, let's focus on this. Let's do better. Let's do something. I don't know. I don't know how to look for recalls of executive orders. I don't know what form that takes and whether anything has been done to rescind it or overwrite it or countermand it or what even the political technical term is. So as far as I know, it's still out there and it still stands. But nobody's going to do anything about it, I think, for a little while, just because new administration and everybody's trying to get their feet wet, and there's a normal transition period of not jumping into anything, but sort of getting the lay of the land when there's a new administration takes over. I mean, we've been through these administration changes before. I just thought this one was interesting just because it happened to fit cybersecurity, and it talked a lot about the stuff we talk about on a regular basis.
For sure. Yeah. The Biden administration was heavy on the supply chain, which I agree with. There was and I believe this is the existing, or this was the Biden administration that put the U.S. ban on auto components to curb. That's my story number 13, which ties into that. There's a 213 page, called it I don't know if it's necessarily a mandate or a memorandum. I think it is a mandate. I would call it a mandate because they're mandating that, for example, and I quote, software components can no longer be sourced from China and Russia, starting with 2027 car models, while by 2030 car models must contain no hardware from prohibited sources. So I'm not sure where the rules fall, hardware versus software. There's a lot of mention of both hardware and software in the 213 page mandate, which I linked to in the show notes. And I'm like, how are companies going to comply with this mandate? I mean, you think about if you already have established supply chains for either hardware or software. I feel software might be easier to pivot in your supply chain, right? But especially with hardware, you can't just go find new hardware. Like everything else has to change. I feel it's a much heavier lift because it's a physical piece of equipment rather than, software, which is a lot more, pliable and, can be changed more easily. You can't change a chip unless you're going to make a new one, right? And that chip has to be integrated in the environment. So there's a lot more consideration when it comes to hardware. I personally believe a better solution is to kind of where the Biden administration was pushing towards, is to have better supply chain security, better supply chain visibility so it doesn't matter where you get it from, even if it comes from China or Russia. If you're evaluating the supply chain security, have detection and protections in your supply chains to, hey, like, is this component backdoor? Like, oh, we have checks for that. Shouldn't matter where it comes from. And that's not to say that like the only backdoored software and hardware you get only comes from China or Russia. Like you're only not even like banning things in general, I think is kind of bad in terms of fixing things, right? But like just saying stuff from this place is bad, so let's just ban it. And then like we're all good. We can wash our hands of it. Well, what if you go get it from somewhere else and your supply chain is tainted? A better process is to have supply chain integrity. I don't know. That's my soapbox.
But how are you going to detect hardware Trojans? What's the test for that?
Hardware is the most difficult one, but I like to think of hardware as really just a glorified paperweight without software, right? So in other words, if you analyze the software, you may or may not, but at certain juncture, you will find the software activating hardware that you didn't know was there. Scanning the actual hardware is a lot more difficult, right? Like X-ray machines and the like are really kind of, it's the only thing that comes to mind, Sam, right? Is
yeah, but look at what just happened to Hezbollah. And when it came out how they did it, they pretty much admitted that there are other products out there already sabotaged by the Mossad, waiting for Israel to get mad at you. So
right.
How are you going to detect that? It's a real threat.
Yeah. I mean, X-ray is really the only thing that I can think of off the top of my head, Sam. Right. But you got to have a clean source. Is that where you're going? You got to have a clean source, right? You know what it should look like to determine.
Well, that's it. Like, I mean, how
like.
in the world would you absolutely know? I don't think there's a single way that you could check through everything, even using X-rays.
Yeah, that's why hardware is super, super hard to detect the tampering and backdoors inside of hardware, for sure.
Well, but doesn't that mean that it is logical to ban hardware from hostile nations? Since you cannot clean them and know it's clean, you could at least know it comes from a nation that isn't opposed to us.
But isn't that kind of what went on with the pagers, assuming you're talking about those, because it just went through a different nation?
Correct.
Well, that's true, but it makes it more difficult. I mean, right now, everything's built with Chinese chips, so we're just asking for it.
Yeah, but it's going to be a long time before we can source chips either locally here in the U.S. So we need other measures in the meantime.
Well, it's supposed to be 5 years, right, until those chip fabs in Texas come up that we started last year anticipating this problem. So
let's hope that we move there.
It'll be 5 years. Yeah. Well, that's the plan.
Right.
I mean, I think we're going to have to do it if we continue to get more hostile towards China, which we seem to be doing. I really don't think we're going to be able to trust anything from China by about 28, the way we're going.
Yeah. But I also feel we still need ways to validate the supply chain, even if it does come locally, right? That still needs to, we can't, in other words, if the adversaries know that we're not going to check stuff that's built locally, they're just going to try and implant themselves in the plants knowing that the checks don't exist.
It's a
Yeah,
trust
we need those
issue.
checks, but I think they haven't even been invented yet.
Well, this is, I guess, related, but the story, not related to, I don't believe this is exactly related to the executive orders, but about DHS disbanding the existing advisory board memberships.
Oh, yeah. I meant to add that story. Thank you, Mandy.
Oh, good. Because I didn't get to, I'm having technical issues. So, but go ahead and add it. Like a couple of things, thinking about the hardware security, even items being manufactured in the US, my understanding a few years ago was that Department of Homeland Security only handles things that are coming from external, right? They don't monitor. There's the things that are generated or threats that are generated inside the borders of the US are handled more likely by the FBI. Let's just go with
I don't have a definitive answer for you, Mandy, but my gut tells me that some of those lines might be blurred. Like post September 11th world, some of those lines are blurred.
Well,
okay.
post 9/11 is what caused DHS to come into existence.
Right.
I would
It
agree
did.
with you that I assume the DHS has a broader playing field, whereas traditionally before 9/11, yeah, FBI was
Right.
internal to the country. CIA could operate anywhere, and NSA had very strict rules about what it could and could not do, especially internally
domestic.
to U.S.
Yeah.
citizens.
Well, this goes back actually, since we mentioned Hackers on the Hill last week, to when I participated in Hackers on the Hill in 2020. And I specifically met with Representative Langevin's office about domestic terrorism and threats that were coming from inside the borders, because he was a founding member of Homeland Security and very specific on cybersecurity policies, but they weren't monitoring. That's what my questions were. Like, how are you monitoring the issues and even in the supply chain and other domestic terrorists, whether they are homegrown or they have separate ideologies? At that time, what I was told directly from the staff was that basically there were 200 FBI agents across the US that were tasked with following up on all of that, including their other duties. And so this relates to this story about, in a moderate way, I
The
guess.
Cyber Safety Review Board and
Yes.
CIS's Cyber Safety Review Board. This article is from Dark Reading, is where I picked it up. It's actually been updated. That Chris Krebs resigned from the CSRB on January 18th, prior to President Trump taking office. Trump administration came in and basically, through a memorandum, not executive order, disbanded the Cyber Safety Review Board. And according to the article, the CSRB was actively working on investigating Salt Typhoon, obviously the Chinese-sponsored hacking group responsible for breaches of at least 9 different telecoms here in the U.S.
And I'm curious for each of you, like, how much do you think the CSRB was producing or being effective?
I'm not sure what the output is. It's a great question, Mandy. My concern is who's leading the investigation now. Someone needs to pick the ball up and continue this investigation, because this is one of the pivotal moments recently in cybersecurity, is the fact that Chinese state-sponsored hackers were able to breach U.S. telecommunications, and probably the most egregious thing is gain access to the wiretap data that they were collecting in the wiretapping systems, which is roughly all we know. Not much more details have been, maybe little bits and pieces here and there, which is also frustrating. But this investigation has to continue, and I tell this in the context of my kids and friends and family asking me why is TikTok going away? TikTok's fine. The Chinese make it perfectly fine app. I'm like, well, I mean, also you realize that China hacked into the telecommunications and stole wiretap data, and they're like, What do you mean? You're just making that up. I'm like, nope, not making it up. Like, that's the real threat. Maybe TikTok isn't the threat. Maybe it is, right? And we can have that debate. I'm like, but what I'm more concerned about is just the one example of Salt Typhoon, and you've got tons of other campaigns that we've traced back to Chinese state-sponsored actors. I mean, as best we could trace it back, that are after all sorts of what I deem critical infrastructure.
This just seems like not the tip of the iceberg exactly, but it seems like a much bigger blow to research as a whole right now.
Well, it's not so much. Yes, it is a blow to research in that, like, some of my frustrations I share, and it fueling the fire is I listen to Ryan's podcast, right? The Three Buddy Problem. And they talk about this a lot, and it gets me fired up too, because I'm like, yeah, where are like the real indicators of compromise? Where are the malware samples? Where's the detailed data that we can all work on as defenders to help us be more resilient to this threat if we have that data? I understand the investigation's ongoing, but it's frustrating, especially with Salt Typhoon, right? We need better information sharing across the board. So
I think it suffices it to say that priorities have not been set yet, or they've been set and we don't know it, and they're probably not in alignment with what we're accustomed to. I was just out of curiosity. I know Jen Easterly was resigning effective inauguration day. You mentioned Chris Krebs. My friend Harry Coker. I was like, yeah, I wonder if he's officially out now. So I just went to his webpage on whitehouse.gov and it's gone. So I assume that means he's gone now, which means he's probably available to have a cigar. So
there you go. Yeah. I mean, not uncommon for any administration.
Oh, certainly
change,
not.
Right. Yeah.
Again, I think priorities are in different places necessarily than what we're accustomed to. And there's, I'm sure, any administration coming in that's got priorities that they're not sharing, because they want to.
Sure. My best guess,
tip the scale.
My gut feeling, cybersecurity as a general priority in this administration is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? Certainly not going to be the highest priority. I think it was much higher priority in the Biden administration in general, just by things we observed, executive orders and the like. I don't think it's going to be a low priority. I don't think they're going to ignore it entirely. I think it's going to be somewhere in the middle, right? And hopefully
is that how you quantify his prior administration too?
I think it was low in the prior administration. Okay. Yeah, I would say the sense I get now is it's a little higher in this because there's stuff that you can't ignore, right? You get the TikTok thing going on that has national attention. You've got Salt Typhoon, which has really garnered a lot of attention as well, mainstream press and all that. So I hope it's a higher priority. Like, again, we're all kind of biased, but also just very fearful of our adversaries on the cyber front, and if we don't pay attention to it, it's going to be a bad day or a series of bad days, right? Certainly those scenarios are plausible today, and we need to work harder and faster to make sure that doesn't become a reality. And we talked about it on the show before, right? Where do we want to go from there? Oh, I thought the Treasury breach thing was interesting, Jeff. That the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's computer was hacked. I heard the Treasury hack was bad, but I think that's really indicative of how bad that really was.
Yep. Yeah, and I had to double check the dates on it because it was almost a week old. Because I'm like, did we cover this already? Was it old news? But I think it's coming out in pieces, and we're getting more information about it. Of course, hopefully that since she's outgoing, her laptop's been locked and disabled and whatever.
Right.
That's an interesting question. How well does the government do when all these positions transition in terms of turning over the technology or refurbishing,
I
reconditioning?
want to say, I
Moving right along.
Well, mentioning the politics, I just heard today that the Trump administration just declared they're giving national security clearance to a bunch of people without bothering with the FBI background checks anymore, just by fiat. So that makes me think of more, boxes of classified documents just sitting in bathrooms in random places.
Well, there is every outgoing president, and Trump was an exception to this. I actually spent some time researching this. I want to say there's a government department for this transition, and I'm not sure if it's just for the president or if they handle like everyone who's transitioning in and out of positions in the U.S. federal government. Someone knows the answer to that, right? But there's like a process as to how you handle classified information. And that process wasn't really followed when Trump left office the first time. Let's hope when Biden leaves office that like there is an official process for that, for the movement and storage of classified information. Also, like something in Jeff, I think you've talked about this on the show, like stuff is only classified in detrimental to our nation in that sense. It has a time period. There's an expiration on it. So,
It
for example,
depends, but yes.
Biden's administration has a bunch of documentation about where the president was, like his travel records and history, right? So, like when the president's traveling, that stuff's super classified, right? Now that like all the travel's done and Biden's exiting out, it still carries a level of classification, but not as high, right? So it depends on the data. And there are, I don't pretend to know all the details, Sam, right? But there are, there are processes for handling that in the U.S. government, which hopefully we follow. It'd be an interesting segment to bring someone on that's like, in like how we handle the equipment and classified materials, if they could even talk. Like, I bet you some of that, the information, how they treat the classified and or technology is probably classified. Get into that whole thing. Lighten the mood just a little bit. Sam, your story number 1 was hilarious. Like I'm in my office and I'm going to Pornhub. Yeah. Like I'm the only one here today. Well, like I was at home and be like, I'm doing research for the show. I don't know what you said. That's right. It's research for the show. I did. Yeah, that's right. I did watch a video on Pornhub in preparation for the show, and it's not what you think.
Oh, well, then you did more than I did. But I mean, I always think this might be an opportunity in case my college shuts down. But anyway, what the OnlyFans model discovered is you can post science and math on Pornhub, and you make more money than you do on YouTube. They pay 3 times as much. And so she says perhaps a lot of it is people are surprised to find serious content there. But this came up in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
The head of the Supreme Court, when they said, is there like serious material on this like there was in Playboy? And the answer is actually yes. Apparently there's quite a bit of non-porn stuff.
There's non-porn stuff on Pornhub, which was shocking news to actually. I knew that before when YouTube was dropping the ban hammer down on certain channels for things like firearms and smoking and vaping and all that stuff. A lot of those channels moved to Pornhub. And Pornhub was like, well, it's fine. Like,
that happened to me. I made a podcast and Google started canceling a bunch of my podcasts from like a year ago because we discussed the early days of the vaccine development.
Yeah, they were big on that.
They banned me for medical misinformation, and they said, we're going to kill your whole channel and take down all your educational content. And I tried to find somewhere to go. I went to Dailymotion, and they just immediately banned me. And I thought I would have to go to Rumble. It didn't occur to me to think of moving my educational content to Pornhub. That might have been a wiser move.
But this content creator, Zara Dar, has a 6-minute explainer video on what are integrals. Which is what are integrals, Sam? You don't explain it as nicely as she does, apparently. Apparently people were impressed with the way she explained it. I didn't know what she was talking about, so.
Oh, I didn't watch that one, but I need to know what integrals are. I mean, you just calculate the area under a curve. But they're important to figure out the volume of containers and stuff.
And her channel, which I checked out, is pretty popular. Lots of comments, and is like understanding AI models and things like that, which is awesome. And I think
Yeah,
but the
sounds
other
good.
big point on that is she makes more money monetizing the content on Pornhub than other platforms, which is,
Yeah.
and she put her content on LinkedIn. And look, she's not naked when she's
Right.
producing the content. Like she has like I would call it a semi low cut shirt on in her videos. It's not like graphic in any sense of the word, in my opinion. But and she's like a PhD, or she was a PhD, was pursuing her PhD.
She was in grad school, but I think she dropped out because she was making
More
more
money.
money on OnlyFans.
Yeah, but LinkedIn killed her content with no explanation.
Yeah. Just like Daily Motion. They nuked
Yep.
me immediately when I was putting up lectures from school. Like, what did I do wrong? What's wrong with this stuff? No clue, no explanation.
Oh yeah,
just,
you're not allowed to talk about the vaccine. That's actually
No, but this was not that. This was like, cybersecurity lectures about, DOS attacks or something. I don't get why somebody would want to take that down instantly with no explanation, but that's what they
I'm
did.
just fast forwarding to next week. All 27 of Paul's stories are going to be Pornhub links.
That's right. It's safe for work. This is the safe for work.
It's now safe for work.
Pornhub.
I've got to say, I'm a little surprised that I guess I don't know. I don't know Pornhub and OnlyFans much, but I know about 5 years ago, people had told me to create, educational content covered, clothed, like you put it out there. So I thought it was more known that there was a lot of information that was on OnlyFans and Pornhub that had nothing to do with what they're usually.
Well, I tell you what I'm worried about is, of course, that the college will block it and all the schools will block it, so your students won't be able to get to it. That's what would make me stop.
Right. I thought we had a free and open.
Libraries will block it. I mean, you're going to miss most of your audience.
I mean, obviously the thing is private companies can have their own policy and it's up to them what content they allow on their various platforms, right? Then it's up to the providers to determine which sites they go to. And this is where all the lines get blurry. And this is why people use proxies to get around that kind of stuff. Yeah. And, I'm all for a free and open internet. And a lot of the things that are happening aren't speaking to a free and open internet necessarily is the way I envision it, right? But also, if you're a private company, you're paying all the bills, you get to determine what content's on your network. What I don't think is fair is they can just turn off your channel without reason, right? Like that's in their terms of service pretty much for every provider out there. YouTube is a classic one. Like there's a line in every, I'm sure if you read every terms of service, there'd be a line in there that's like, yeah, like basically we can take your content down for absolutely no reason without warning, and we don't owe you any explanation. And that's the scary part about hosting content on these platforms.
So I'm going to make a political statement, Paul.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions in this country is thinking that we live in a free country, that we have unfettered freedom to do whatever, freedom of speech and all that kind of stuff.
Or that we always have accurate information. And
well, what I'm getting at,
it's different, but
the what's in wanting a free and open internet, like a free and open country, what's missing is regulation. Whereas historically in this country, we have regulation. And sometimes it takes years and generations to come about it, but it gets there eventually. I don't think anybody has really figured out how to do it on the internet yet, since the internet does not contain traditional, in any way, shape, or form, boundaries.
Yeah. Well, it's very pliable. You can put boundaries in place, but people find their ways around them, right?
Yeah, put an endpoint on the internet, or put an edge control on the internet somewhere. Hard to do.
Yep.
And like you said, easy to get around. So I mean, so it's the difficulty of regulation. So yeah, you have companies that do it themselves willy-nilly, which we're not accustomed to. And in a physical sense, if a company wants to refuse service to someone, there's regulation in place that limits or at least provides a framework of rules of how they do that in a consistent.
There are rules. Yeah. I think your point, Jeff, right, is we don't live in a lawless society, right? We have certain liberties, but we're also governed by laws and regulations as well, which is an important balance, right? It kind of speaks to my story number 14, right? In terms of private companies selling a product that you buy, they are afforded certain liberties, and they're also governed by regulation. And I don't know how many of you are 3D printing. Larry and Bill, I know, are 3D
Sorry,
printers.
your geek friends aren't on the show tonight,
Yeah,
Paul.
I'm relatively new to 3D printing, but I do use Bambu Labs 3D printers. And I've seen this kind of trend where people get upset about Bambu Labs firmware and restrictions that they're putting on it. And they just introduced a new authorization control system for their firmware. In terms of the updates to their new firmware updates, will introduce authorization controls. It will require authorization within your account for certain critical printer operations. And what that means is, what they say is, unauthorized third-party software will be prohibited from executing critical operations. So the Bambu Labs community is kind of up in arms about this, in terms of they like to use third-party slicer software. Slicer software is what you take in your model, and you can see how it will print on your 3D printer, and basically step through all the slices, right? That's your slicer software. Bambu Labs makes Bambu Studio, totally fine, does all the authorization, right? Will continue to work just fine. A lot of people are using third-party slicer software, which may not work with this firmware update. There's also the X-Touch community, which is a free and paid version where you can basically take a cheap yellow display, little hardware things that Larry and Bill presented at ShmooCon, and put software on there that allows you to control your printer and get better analytics from it. I don't think it will impact the X-Touch displays and software. I do think it will impact your third-party slicer software. So I'm just, curious to see how it plays out. I linked to a Tom's Hardware article that goes into a little more detail about it, but I kind of think people are a little more like up in arms. It's, Bambu Labs is not an open platform, unfortunately, right? I think there are 3D printers that do adopt more of the open platform, open firmware, which again, as we've talked about, the difference between Linux and Apple's App Store, like the security models are very different, right? In terms of the more control that a central company has, the better position they are to offer enhanced security. The more open you are, the more it's kind of a free-for-all when it comes to security, and Linux is certainly an example of that. I think that's what's at work here with the Bambu stuff. I like the Bambu, ecosystem. Again, I'm still kind of a newbie when it comes to this ecosystem in 3D printing. So I had on my project list to do an X-Touch display on a cheap yellow display, and I hope that continues because that seemed kind of cool. But yeah, that's Bambu, the latest in Bambu Labs firmware controversy, if you will.
I
Well, how
haven't
does it
3D
compare
printed in
to?
I'm sorry. I
Sorry.
say it's been like 3 years since I've done anything, so I haven't kept up on 3D printing, but I did like
It's
Bambu
much better
too.
now.
It is easier. I will say you can get into the printer that Dave Johnson brought on the show last year, the year before. We did a segment with Dave where he brought a 3D printer into the studio. It was a Bambu Labs A1 Mini, and those are on sale now for $200. And I know several roughly 8-year-old kids, at least two. One of them is my son. One of them is another friend of the family. And they're awesome at it. They can get this $200 printer and they're 3D printing, right? Like they're not messing with all, like years ago, I'd talk to my friends that bought 3D printers, right? And they'd be like, it's a lot of work and fiddling and I had to put it together and all that stuff. Like you literally take it out of the box. 20 minutes later, you're 3D printing and your 8-year-olds are having a great time 3D printing all kinds of trinkets and stuff. And they're doing great at it. I think it was Grifter I was talking to. I was like, dude, like, what is it with like the youngest kids in my family are just amazing at 3D printing? And I think that's a crowning achievement of where we are in technology, right? Is to let the younger hackers be hackers without having to have all those roadblocks, right? And so
I
I'm
still
a
give
little more.
my,
I'm a little more like lenient on Bambu Labs if they want to keep a slightly more closed system to keep it easier to use, a la like the Apple model, right? Like I'm willing to make some of those trade-offs.
the Apple model in the sense of the iPhone.
Yeah, in the sense of we control everything. We want a great user experience at the price of the freedom and luxury to kind of tinker with the underpinnings on your own.
Well,
Right?
that's what I was going to ask you about was, how much do you correlate this to? Of course, I'm an Android owner, but smartphones in general, we're not supposed to jailbreak them and get root access and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
We own them. We spend a freaking lot of money on them,
A lot of money.
but
Yep.
we don't get to tear apart. Or a generation ago, when you got a laptop, when that was the thing, but it had that pesky sticker on the back that said if you opened it up, you void the warranty.
Wow.
I got
I
a little
void
bit of an
warranty.
update
Yeah, go ahead,
on.
Mandy.
Okay, so your question about the provisioning of assets and all of the changeover during the administration changeover.
Yes.
And so I asked kind of insiders, and here's what I learned. They said, so the GSA, which is the General Services Administration,
Yep.
is responsible for the presidential transition, and their CIO is Dave Sheave. Maybe the former GSA CISO would be a good person to talk to about it since he recently went private. That's Bo Morales. Does anybody here know Bo Morales?
It sounds vaguely familiar, actually.
So, and then I got a link to the GSA, but this person said they don't know exactly what it's like inside the president's office or administration.
Yeah, because there's the obviously the presidential transition is one thing, but obviously people are transitioning in and out of U.S. and military positions all the time, and there has to be other offices, right, with processes for how that happens to protect sensitive information. So I think
It's
interesting.
government. That there's process.
There's a process. There's a lot of process, right? Yes, there's a lot of process around it for sure. For sure. Hey, I want to get everyone's take on my story number 15. So, we all know the story of Silk Road, right? We covered it when it came out. We tracked it very closely. Most of us probably watched the movie that was I thought pretty good about what transpired in those events, and there's a lot to the story, right? Obviously, Silk Road was used to facilitate the sale of goods and or services that were not necessarily legal. Here in the U.S., there was the hits, the murder for hire that happened. There was corrupt law enforcement that was attempting to profit off of this in terms of stealing cryptocurrency. So there's a lot of aspects to it. Doesn't surprise me there was a movie just in everything I just mentioned, right? So one of the pardons from now U.S. President Donald Trump was Ross Ulbricht. And he received a full pardon. And so Dread Pirate Roberts in 2015 was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus an additional 40 years with no chance of parole, which is just like when we talk about, I think, the analogy of throwing the book at someone, this is the shining model of throwing the book at someone. And I think there's a lot of people who believe that was an unfair punishment for this. Just the sentencing in and of itself was super harsh, to say the least, right? Like you couldn't give, short of the death penalty, you couldn't really give someone a longer sentence. Is that true, Sam? You want to pipe in on this one?
Well, yeah, but I actually spoke to the head of FBI cybercrimes about this, and I asked him, why did you give him so much time? And he said, because of the drugs. And I was sort of stunned. Okay. I said, well, I'm from California. I forgot drugs were illegal, but I thought it would be the murders.
Sure.
To me, the
but
murders
he wasn't
are
convicted.
a problem. But the guy...
I'm glad you brought that up, Sam, because he was not convicted of the murders. It's a somewhat controversial point on his case that the murder for hire was brought up during trial. So there's public record of this activity, but Ross was never convicted of the murder for hire. Which I don't know if he did it or not.
Never convicted. Was he found innocent or was he never tried?
Well,
No, I
this
think the
says he
murder
was
never
indicted
charged.
in
Happened.
Maryland.
He was never charged, Jeff. I'm sorry. That it's a good
He should
point.
have
He
been
was not
charged for
charged.
attempted murder.
He should have.
Yeah, well, I don't think they bothered because the punishment for drugs
Was
was
much
more.
more. That's exactly
Yeah.
what I got after I read the article from the Register. I was like, it sounds like after sentencing, they were like, well, there's no need to go after him for the murder for hire because
Right.
he already got like multiple life sentences. Like there's no chance of parole.
Yeah.
Blah blah blah. Like what else would they
But-
do?
Well, guess what? There's no
But
statute of limitations
yeah.
on murder.
Yeah, but basically the guy was like a cartel leader. He was running
Right.
an organization, pushing tons of guns, drugs, and murder, and how can you not lock this guy up forever? What possible justification is there for letting him out? Who
Right.
would you put in jail? Who
But it's not.
Who would you keep in jail that has done something like this?
Yeah.
I mean,
It's not murder by his own hands. It's murder for hire.
it's not. The cartel leaders don't kill by their own hands
Yeah,
either.
okay.
Neither do mafia leaders.
Right.
They send hitmen to go
But
kill him.
we
He hired
process
hitmen to kill
mafia
people.
leaders on racketeering.
Sure. And I know. And so, but the point is, he did really terrible stuff. How can you, if you're going to let him out, you should just let everybody out.
No, it's certainly one take, right, on it.
Yeah.
I would feel differently if he was actually charged and convicted of the murder for hire. I would feel differently, right? But it's kind of like a case where we'll never know, right? What exactly happened? Did he really do it? And he
Apparently
certainly
not.
wasn't convicted in court of murder for hire, which is one thing. Whether
I
he
think-
did it or not, we will never know.
I think the pardon power is completely out of control.
There's just been a lot
And
of
our claim
pardons,
to be
yeah.
a nation. Our claim to be a nation ruled by laws just seems to be ridiculous
pardon
now.
thing,
It seems
yeah.
like rich people are exempt from the laws, and everybody's exempt from the law if the next president likes you. So, do we really bother with laws in prisons? It's not clear
crazy,
we're accomplishing
right?
anything.
It is a crazy aspect. I think if you, it's hard to put aside the murder for hire thing, right? Because it is in unknown.
And by the way, he also sold guns, and I think he sold contract killing services
Right.
on the site
Mhm.
where other people were buying hitmen. Even if his hitmen weren't actually killing people, the others probably were. I mean, the guy is like a Mexican cartel leader with this giant crime mob. How can you not punish him?
Right. But there's also the argument that, he was just running the site and people are going to do what they do. And he doesn't claim responsibility for that.
Okay, but
So the
ordering
CEO of every company is not responsible for what his company does. I mean,
This is true. They are. In today's day and age, they absolutely are.
And from this article in the Register, it says the Free Ross campaign describes him as an idealistic entrepreneur who never intended harm. And that he deeply regrets and he has learned his lesson and he will never break the law again.
That's what we would all say if we were in Ross's
Right.
it's just like Pete Hegseth promises he's going to stop drinking too. I mean, everybody says they're going to quit doing bad stuff when they're being punished.
But it also seemed like a political move.
I'm sorry I was caught.
But also the article alludes
Yeah,
to
that's
it
right.
being a political move. It seemed to me like when I read the article that the Trump administration agrees with the Libertarian Party, and it was kind of a support for that political.
It was in honor of his mother, of Ross's mother, who had campaigned for his release. And then the message that the president wrote on his social media site, Truth Social, was that he had called the mother, let her know that he
in
had been
honor of
fully
her in the libertarian movement.
supporting his campaign.
That's what got me. That it was
Well,
not so
the
much about the
libertarians-
actual case. It was more about I want to support this movement. So pardoning this person gives me support for this movement. I mean, not to drag politics into it, right? But politicians are all about appealing to a base of people that support them, right?
Yes,
and this
the
seemed
ones
like
with
me,
the money. They're
right?
ones with the money,
Exa-
right.
right,
Depending on what
exactly.
you
And so this
value,
seemed to me
right.
like a political move to get support from people. So
Well,
That's
yeah, but I mean, the
totally-
libertarians also want to open all the borders and let all the immigrants in. We'll see how much Trump loves that.
Right.
And I think they would like to pretty much empty the prisons and forgive people for a whole lot of the crimes. But I don't think that's where America's going.
But
it's
there's
crazy. But I
don't
mean,
think
Ross
there's
is a free person now. I mean, whether you agree with it or not,
He
Ross is a
is.
free person, and I think from a security and technology perspective, that's kind of interesting.
It seems like if you're rich or famous, the laws don't apply to you.
Well,
long as
I
you
mean,
can just get on Fox
I think
News or
that's always
something.
been the case in this country, Sam.
Well, in this world.
It
In
has
the
not
world,
been this
right?
bad.
I think you agreed, Jeff. Go back in history,
No,
right?
No, I think our level of corruption is reaching a peak, just like the previous Gilded
Oh.
Age. We're reaching a situation of ridiculous inequality in terms of law and money to the level where it probably cannot persist. There's got to be a revolution of some
Breaking
kind
point.
when you have this much inequality. Yeah.
Let's see. I want to dive into a slightly technical thing. So my story number 10, ZEDI, the Zero Day Initiative, released a review of the attack surface of an EV charger. What I thought was interesting in overlaps with my current research that I'm actually working on an article, is the ESP32 is used for Bluetooth communications in this particular platform. Now, the article didn't go into how or if the ESP32 is protected in any way or what security mechanisms were present or not, including secure boot, which I found is available on the ESP32 platform, which for a lot of us, listening that have done that, obviously, is not new to you, but it's new to me in terms of how the ESP32 platform does things like firmware encryption and or secure boot, which are two totally independent things. So I'm curious on this particular platform, like were those put in place on the chip? Was there any kind of firmware encryption? Was there any kind of secure boot? Knowing UEFI secure boot at the level that I know it, which is not great compared to some of my coworkers, especially, but just knowing what I know about UEFI secure boot, the ESP32 secure boot and firmware encryption as kind of an add-on to that is interesting in that on the ESP32 chip in the designs, there are 4 eFuse blocks. And so you have 4 of those at your disposal for basically you can write data to a fuse once, and then once it's closed off, it's closed off. It physically, go ahead, Sam.
This is just what got beat last week, right? On the Raspberry Pi had one of these things, the deactivated core, and they were able to send a spike and reactivate the deactivated core.
Oh, is that a deactivated core like an eFuse or something different?
I think it was, but that's what I'm not sure.
This is like
I'm not sure.
Basically permanent storage. So on an ESP32, you use one of the fuse, I believe one of the fuse blocks to enable secure boot. So what I read this week was if you enable secure boot on an ESP32 chip, you can't disable it. It's not like in UEFI where you can kind of flip back and forth. Once the boot, you have to compile a bootloader specifically on the ESP32 platform to say enable secure boot. Once it does that, all subsequent boots will attempt to initiate secure boot. Then you use another fuse, I believe, an additional fuse to fuse your key, which will be used to validate firmware that will boot in the secure boot process. And then if you need to like rotate a key, like let's say you're like, oh, that key is no good, like I lost a private key or someone stole the private key, as an example, you basically have to fuse another key into another fuse, but you only got 4 of those total, right? And the encrypting firmware uses another fuse block to store the key to decrypt the firmware. But also, like these chips are like $1, right? So it's not
right.
Yeah, you would just get another ESP32 chip because they're meant for IoT, more of development. But here it is being used in the wild, and I was like, oh, they're using the protections that like I just read about. And so there was a great tutorial that I found on GitHub that talks about the 4 different fuse blocks and what they're used for. And it only has 4. So like evil person me is like, well, if I can get firmware on that ESP32 chip, conceivably I could write code that would fuse junk into all 4 fuses, and then you'd be screwed, right? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
So.
But it sounds like a good idea, though, for security.
Yeah.
If you're going to make it a secure boot, you want to have no way to turn that off. That sounds logical.
That is pretty cool. And again, when we're talking about a $10,000 or $100,000 server, probably not a great idea, right? But when you're talking about a chip that like it costs a couple dollars for the chip, that's a much better approach. But it was interesting to see the ESP32 be used in an IoT application like this and kind of try and figure out like what are they using the security mechanisms that are available.
But in IoT, you frequently have physical access to the device for an attack. Could you just remove the chip or replace it in that case?
You could. That's a great point. If I were to remove, like
But would it all
desolder,
be encrypted
and
with a
remove
key
the ESP32 chip.
Yeah, but would that just remove the key so you can't get at any of the data? Hopefully, that's what would happen.
If the firmware was encrypted, you wouldn't be able to put the encrypted firmware back, right?
Right. Well, then it's protecting data, right? That's the point of it. And hopefully all that data is encrypted with a key that's only on that chip you're removing. So replacing it will not get you anything.
I think you're right in that assumption, Sam. Yeah. I thought it was interesting to kind of run through these scenarios. You're going exactly where my brain wanted to go with, like, what are the attack
you
scenarios?
Definitely want. Well, you want to get hardware hackers to attack it, just like they did with the Raspberry Pi, and see if they really did close all these doors or if there's something they overlooked, like there was on the Pi.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I'm saying it's not bad. It's just it's different way of thinking about a different environment, kind of thing.
Yeah. The whole idea of having secure data on a IoT device is kind of crazy, and
right.
So we'll see. Physical access usually means you can't really protect the data.
Right. The other thing was, like, if I gained access to this device, and let's say there was no firmware encryption, no secure boot on the ESP32, that means I could compile my own firmware, send it to that device, and implant inside this device, inside the ESP32 chip. So if they ignored those two security controls within the ESP32 ecosystem, it really means, as an attacker, all I need to do is come up with my own firmware, and I can do whatever I want. In fact, I can enable secure boot in my firmware, and that means you can't put any other firmware on that device. I could encrypt my firmware. I could essentially, if the security is not in place in the first place, I could, as an attacker, use that to my advantage, which is interesting as well.
Yeah. To Sam's point, he's got me thinking, Get Smart, Mission Impossible. People start tampering devices, they blow up, they melt, the smoke starts pouring out. What exists in terms of tamper protection for these types of boards these days? And is it just too cost prohibitive to put on most IoT devices?
Yeah, not much. There was, in the Raspberry Pi example, Sam, remember there was the fault injection protection that they had to bypass.
Right. And that's why you need pen testers, hardware pen testers, to see if your defenses can actually stop them. Because the old rule was, if they get physical access to your device, your security is shot. So we're trying to overcome that vulnerability, and that's a tall order.
Yeah, I think it's next to impossible to create a hardware firmware platform that's resilient to physical attacks. I mean, we see this with BitLocker. In fact, I had a story, I didn't write it up, about Windows BitLocker screwed without a screwdriver. This is the latest Windows BitLocker thing, right? That doesn't, this one in the title, right, says it doesn't require physical access to it. And we've seen just like a proliferation, if you will, of BitLocker attacks, successful attacks against BitLocker. Also, that's dependent on the configuration as well. But physical access to me, and I've done a lot of research on this, it's kind of like game over. Like, and again, it depends on the motivation of the attacker. Like, we talked about the bike theft thing. Losing your hardware, right? Someone steals something, like, they're just going to resell. They're not going to care about getting access to the data. But if someone does care and has some resources available, which doesn't need to be in today's day and age, where you can buy computing really cheap, physical access in a motivated attacker they're going to get access to your data.
Well, I don't think we can accept that, because so many people have powerful laptops and IoT devices and iPhones. The fact is, we are constantly losing physical access to important devices, and we can't just say, accept that you're losing all that data.
I think two things. Really need. One, don't store it on the local device that can be stolen in the first place. Store it up in the cloud, right?
But everybody's doing
Everyone's doing it.
Everybody has their photos on their phone.
So the other thing is remote wipe, right? Like, if it has connectivity, wipe it remotely. But criminals are in tune with that. So like once they swipe a device, they put it in a Faraday cage.
Right. So I mean, I think there's a real market for some kind of chip like you've been describing that will actually protect the data on your IoT device from a physical attack. I think we need that. And it can't be impossible. It's just difficult.
You got to raise the bar. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
You're not gonna solve it completely, but you're gonna raise the bar. Yeah, make it so expensive for the attacker that
like BitLocker provides considerable protection, even though there are some bypasses.
I agree. There's bypasses, but you're right, Sam. If someone it does set a bar for how tall you got to be to ride the ride. If I'm after that data, agreed.
This to me is one of the big ironies of our digital age, because a generation or two ago, physical access was the only way you could get it data. You had to break into a building and break into a safe or a cabinet or something. And then we put everything online and made it all freely accessible and available. And then, we should probably try to secure and protect.
By the way, if
and
you want to
go in business today, by the way,
if you want to go watch an awesome talk, and I'm biased because Deviant's a friend, but Deviant gave the most amazing talk at ShmooCon on safe cracking. It was like engaging, technically accurate, like just engaging is really like I was not falling asleep. I was like hanging on every word. Like what's he going to show next? Like what's he going to show next? It was one of the best talks that I've watched in a long time. So I told Deviant that at ShmooCon. I'm like, dude, that wasn't like, I'm not just saying that. Like that was a really, really, really awesome talk. So if you're going to go check out talks at ShmooCon, make sure you watch Deviant.
Are you suggesting maybe we should put our data back in the safe? Or even the safes are not safe?
Or the safe isn't safe, right?
But it's the same thing we were talking about, right? Like different levels of you put your stuff in a safe, not so no one in the world could ever access it, right? Like that's not necessarily the intention. It's like how motivated, how skilled does an attacker have to be to get at that? And he talks about all the different levels. I didn't realize most safes, like in the U.S. federal government, look like filing cabinets with a dial on it. He talked a lot about those safes.
Diebold.
Diebold's one of the main. He talked about all of the history of the manufacturers. Yeah, just awesome stuff. Speaking of ShmooCon talks, I didn't realize that someone whose name I don't have. I want to say it was Dylan Aray, who is the author of this blog that talks about oAuth and how domain ownership intersects with oAuth. Gave this presentation remotely. It doesn't. I don't think I caught exactly why, but whatever. Wasn't able to attend, but ShmooCon made an effort, and he thanked him for doing it, for him to be able to present this research remotely, which is awesome because I think it's fantastic research. Because I read his article, and I love this because it's like a hacker mindset kind of thing, in that we ask questions because we're curious, and then when we go find the answers, we're like, wow, that's really bad. And so Dylan asked the question, like, all these startups that fade away, like unsuccessful startups, and they leave their domains hanging around, and they're just like, whatever. Like, what happens if you were to go register that domain? What could you do with it? Well, it turns out oAuth, in the context of Google, will allow you to basically take over the privilege level of that original domain via oAuth. So, failedstartup.com, it's available. I register that. I believe, and I don't know if it states it in the blog post or in the presentation, but like I then create a G Suite account based on that domain. And then I go, I want to use Slack, and I'm just going to use this domain with my email address. And oh, by the way, now I'm authenticated as the previous person who was at this domain at that email address, because there's only two fields that Google oAuth expects, right? Is your email address, your user ID, and your domain. And as long as you have those two artifacts in oAuth, you can authenticate to ChatGPT, Slack, Notion, Zoom, And what he says is a whole lot more, including HR systems, right? If they're using Google's like authenticate with Google thing, you can impersonate these tokens essentially and gain access to all of that information. Google's refused to fix this.
Sure.
Google's like,
Yeah.
this is not a fixable thing.
Well,
It's hard to, but like the providers like Slack and others can't really fix this either. Like it has to be fixed by Google. And he offers some suggestions for a proposed fix. Unique identifiers, right, that expire, I believe, was the gist of.
But I mean, how could Google fix it? Because I see it as an administrative problem. The problem is the startup didn't properly decommission their cloud resources. How does Google know that company is dead and gone if they don't tell them?
There could be, I agree, Sam. Another proposed fix could be that there is a process when you decommission a domain to tell Google,
I think there has to
wipe
be.
it out. That's a great point. I'm not sure how that would work, but in concept, I'm grokking that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this just is the cloud version of the old thing where you don't clean your things before you throw them away so people find hard drives in the trash. When you're go out of business, you have to sanitize your physical media and you also have to sanitize your cloud resources.
Right. I mean, or just, park the domain.
Well, you have to evaluate those risks. Right. But of course, a lot of startups are just racing ahead and then they run out of money and just walk out and
they
quit.
Walk out and quit. And they just leave the domain and the domain expires. And he says there are over 100,000 domains in the article is what he says. Available. I forget. I don't know where it is. So wait.
Well, I'm sure there are because a ton of startups crash like a train. They crash. Everything's broken. Everybody just runs away.
So he says
nobody bothers to.
And I quote, I went through Crunchbase's startup database and found over 100,000 domains currently available for purchase from failed startups.
And some of those startups probably got acquired by somebody who hasn't bothered to spin them up again yet. So if they were to neutralize everything in the cloud, they wouldn't want that. I mean, how is Google supposed to know what to do? This is like when somebody dies and you go to like Facebook and say, I want to get in their account. How do they know?
So he says a proposed fix is Google could implement 2 immutable identifiers with its OpenID Connect, a unique user ID that doesn't change over time, and a unique workspace ID tied to the domain. He opened up a ticket, and Google didn't. So then as for details of the fix, but there was no information. Blah blah blah. So downstream providers don't have a great way to put this down, and then there's a link to his Shmookon talk.
Yeah.
So my solution to this is if you got a failed startup, just don't let the domain expire. Just keep it. Right.
Well, the question is what failed means. And what failed usually means is everybody is disgusted. Everybody just walks away. Nobody's in charge.
Right. It has to go on a credit card somewhere to maintain the domain. And for 100,000 of those, no one bothered.
I completely understand that.
Yeah, so I thought it was pretty cool research as well.
Yeah.
Sam had several AI stories. I would
yes, let's talk about AI.
Because
AI is...
Yeah.
Well, it's incredible. I mean, how much trouble there is with AI and how everybody just keeps pouring more money into it. Like, I think both OpenAI and I think Google both said they're going to spend $80 billion on AI next semester. And Trump just announced that they made a government consortium to put $500 billion in AI. So the money going into AI just seems to be immense. And yet all the products seem to have serious flaws. Like Apple AI is what I expected to be the best. The one built into your phone. I thought if anybody can make a good product, it's going to be Apple. And it has been a disaster. Nobody wants it. Nobody's getting any good out of it. They had to pull it down because it was inaccurately writing headlines of stories to where even the BBC told them to turn this thing off.
Was that your story on it, inaccurately writing? I thought that was ChatGPT.
Quite a few, but Apple did. My story number 4.
Okay.
Apple's so bad that when that guy Mangione shot the CEO, the Apple summary of that headline was Mangione committed suicide in prison, which is completely wrong. And their AI summaries tend to be like that. But OpenAI made a ChatGPT made ChatGPT tasks where you can write a bot that will do something for you, and the guy that tested it had the same results. When you make it do like a news summary, something like any of us might do, have AI scour these news sources and summarize them, the summaries were terrible.
Yeah.
The stories were year out of
It's really
date.
bad at summarizing news or collecting and summarizing news.
I thought that was what it was good at. I mean,
I don't
what is
know,
it good at
but
then?
it seemed to take a turn for the worse. I was using Perplexity to explain this article to me, and I just
Yeah.
I kind of got away from it because it was complaining. It'd be like, oh, I can't do that for you. I'm like, yeah, but you've done that for me in the past. Like, then I get into arguments with it, and I'm like, it's just not worth it.
So
Well, OpenAI did cheapen the product about 6 months ago. It suddenly got much worse. What they found is it's really expensive to run it. Like the latest the latest model that they claim can reason like a human costs $1,000 per query to run.
Yeah,
So that's another issue.
right.
But it begs the question: is this limitations of AI, or is this a natural evolution of AI, or is there something behind this that is driving AI to behave like this?
I'm more with the natural evolution.
for good
though,
or
Sam.
bad
What do
reasons.
you think?
Well, the big money, people are all saying they believe it's going to get a whole lot better. So it's okay to just keep having more and more money pour into it, even though the current versions are like buggy early betas that don't work very well. So that's the question. They all seem to blithely assume it's going to get 10 or 100 times better than it is now.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But it goes in
And
certain. I think
don't-
certain
yeah.
aspects get better. Certain aspects are equally crappy. And I think with the
Yeah.
article thing, sometimes it regresses. Right? We go in the wrong direction until we learn
No.
to start getting it back up.
It reminds me of the internet
Yeah.
in like 1998 when people said, oh, it went up by a factor of 10. It'll keep going up by a factor of 10 every
it
year.
won't.
And
Yep.
therefore,
we're going to regress
I know.
and then go back and forth. And we're going to have 8 million different web technologies until we.
And it will hit some kind of limit to where it quits getting better
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah. Until like the next evolution, right? So it's tough to say where it's going to go, and there's certain use cases that are better than others in certain points in time. Right now, so
Well,
what I'm a big fan of is the contextualization of the various conversations. So I love ChatGPT's GPTs that other people have air quotes trained. They're really just like pre-prompting it for you. It's not training. They're pre-prompting it for you to give it better results. That's kind of a cheat and hack, if you will. But for example, I'm using it for Arduino programming right now. And if I just ask like the regular models, like good Lord, like it's like all bets are off. I get all kinds of crap. But if I use the pre-prompted GPTs, I get much better results. They're still not like fantastic results, but the results are good enough to help me as if I had a junior programmer assisting me and also someone to explain it to me, because I'm really rusty with C++. And that's what Arduino is written in. And so I'm like, oh, like explain to me how that works again. And even if it's 80% of the way there, I'm like, oh no, I know what you're jiving at. Like it jogs my memory, but I'm not completely new to C++. It might be.
Yeah, I've got the same experience a lot. When it makes code suggestions, they are helpful. And when I go to Google, about half the time, the AI summary is in fact helpful.
Google's AI summary has gotten better. Did you notice that too? I was going to say that. It's gotten better.
Yeah.
It's gotten
It
better.
has gotten better.
Because I
feel
disabled it.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Do you notice too?
I leave it there and
I've
I check
totally
it.
noticed
It's
that it
gotten
has gotten better. Like I feel like I'm much more satisfied more regularly with the results that it gives immediately, which
Maybe
I
it's
hadn't
training
noticed.
you.
Yeah.
It could be.
A couple of months ago, I was actually going to Bing because Google sucked so much. And now I'm back to Google because it's working better.
No, same. That's what I was going to say. It was like I was using Bing, and then I use PyAI a lot, and then, but I have been more consistently satisfied with Google's AI.
What was that one before PyAI?
Oh, P-I. It's just
I didn't know there
PyAI.
was one. Okay. PyAI. Okay. I tried using Perplexity about 6 months ago, and I rapidly started getting things wrong.
MF.
Perplexity is good for, it was good for certain things. It seemed to have regressed a little bit. I've been going back to Chat GPT a little more. Again, largely for the GPTs. They've got some ones for Arduino that have super helped me. I'm like, I need to implement this. And again, it's like 80. I'm like, you're not fully understanding what I want to do. And I'm giving it like, I'm not giving it all my source code. I'm just giving it like the main.cpp. I'm not giving it all the libraries and all that stuff. So I'm kind of doing myself a disservice. I probably have to link to my full GitHub and see if it can consume that and do a little better. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But I'm getting good results from that in terms of like, it's guiding me in the right direction. I'm not implementing exactly what it says, but it's getting me to a point where I'm like, I'm making progress faster than I would by myself. And that's what I think is the advancement in AI in a nutshell, right? Is we can make advancements faster than we would without it. And that's why people are pouring money into this, right? Because it is helping.
It is getting better. It reminds me of like search engines in like the late 90s when there was like Alta Vista that really didn't work very well. And then Google came out with something that was a giant leap forward that was so much better. But previous to that, it was all sort of half broken things that weren't much good. So, a lot of people are betting that one of these companies is going to come up with something that's 10 times better. And I thought it was Apple Intelligence. I thought it was going to be the thing that really helps you live. And now they're going to push it out whether you like it or not with the next Apple update. Sounds like I'm going to have it, whether I want it or not. And that's a bad sign in marketing when you have to force it on people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but Apple's also famous for forcing things on people they didn't want, but then we do want it.
Well, I'm not opposed to if it actually worked and was helpful, but the people who have been testing it all say it's not, in fact, doing me any good.
But they don't have Steve Jobs, God rest his soul, but he was famous for that.
Well, I mean, if it would read all my email and all the other forms of contact coming in and efficiently tell me which of that stuff is important, that would be helpful.
The
I can do
context
that.
for that is
None of it is important.
Most of it's not.
That's my current policy. And every now and then people complain. People complain and say, I emailed you something. Why didn't you answer? That's what I keep getting.
Yeah. Jeff, what did your story number 6, Mitre launched something to standardize vocabulary, as you put it.
Yeah, I just saw that and I thought it was interesting. And what piqued my interest, I'm sorry, Josh isn't here or Larry isn't here to emphasize that I like to harp on vocabulary. I had not heard of this before I saw this article, so I don't know how much difference it'll make. But the fact that somebody's trying to repackage what NSA did 50 years ago and put it into something that's more palatable and public facing, that coming from a company like Mitre that more people recognize and respect, let's say, I think is probably a good thing.
Well, I think so. I think this is the first step of science, is just taxonomy, separating things into categories. Then we can start hopefully becoming more reproducible and scientific about rating the quality of defenses and improving defenses. I think this is important. I'm going to have to get my students to learn it.
And what is ontology?
What is Scientology?
It's in my notes.
I mean, ontology.
Ontology.
It's not oncology. It's ontology.
Oncology.
I put the definition right in the
ontology.
Notes, so you don't have to Google and.
I think it's definition.
Audio listeners.
It's definition number 2: a set of concepts and categories in a subject area or domain that shows their properties and relations between them.
That everybody agree on.
Well, they didn't say that.
It's the first step of science, is to just sort things into categories. Like, these people have cancer, these people have schizophrenia. First you just group people. And then after you've made groups, then you can hopefully make progress understanding and dealing with it.
And then you know who to send to the oncologist, Randy.
But who do you send to an ontologist?
Nobody.
Is it when we're having fights over semantics and then we have to go to an ontologist?
Well,
yes.
Absolutely, yes. There needs to be a source of truth where there's an agreed upon definition of terms. Where you lacking that, you have our vendor space today and all the terminology that's out there. That what I hate the most is when the terminology becomes doctrine and gospel when nobody still agrees on what the definition is, but people use it emphatically in a sentence, and everybody's like, oh yeah, that's the way it is.
So, Jeff, I will take a page out of your book from terminology and express my frustration with the way the cybersecurity press is using the term 0 day, because they are grossly misusing this term. And I see that when I look at all the news feeds that I have, and I see the latest insert XYZ vendor here, 0 day being exploited. And I'm like, hold on a second. The vendor released a patch for that. Like, it's not a 0 day anymore. Like, you're just using the term 0 day so more people click on it. That's exactly why they're using that. And I see this so much more in the past 6 months than I have ever before in the 20 years of this show. And I'm like, stop doing that. It is not a 0 day. It is even the fact that even if you've disclosed it and published it, but there is no patch available, it's still not a 0 day. Like, we call that a half day. I forget. I think it was Sneak or someone else.
Well, dare I say, is 0 day an adjective and not a noun?
I think it's both.
Is it?
No, maybe it's not. Is it a verb
I've
too?
heard this
Is it a
argument
verb?
Yeah.
Wait.
I've heard this argument for years, and I think you're right that it's not really a 0 day unless nobody even knows about it at all. So you don't even know the
I think
brand name or anything.
0 day to me is the vendor doesn't know about it.
Right. I was going to say, wouldn't it require that bad actors know about it in order for it to be anything?
Somebody knows about it.
I actually,
Right.
but
Well,
I
sure,
actually
what
classify a 0 day vulnerability versus a 0 day exploit. So I classify a 0 day vulnerability as a vulnerability that someone has disclosed, for which exploit, different thing. Vulnerability, I described a vulnerability, and the vendor did not know about it, does not know about it, and has not released a patch for it. Right? Then you get into
but there could be a workaround,
but
right?
you get into like half day where like the vendor knows about it, but they haven't released a patch. Right.
So now
then
we're
you got
either getting into entomology or etymology. One's studying bugs and one is studying the word.
What happens if you could put in something like a firewall rule to block it, but you can't really patch it? Is that still a 0 day or what? Because
to me, 0 day is all like hinging on the fact about vendor knowledge. Whoever makes the software, hardware, widget, whatever that has the vulnerability does not know about it. It has not had has had 0 days to release a patch for it.
You're defining the word, but the word, the way you used it, and we could argue whether it's one word or two words, I guess, but or a hyphenated word. But you're using it in adjective form. A 0 day vulnerability or a 0 day exploit, that's an adjective.
Right.
I think the point you were trying to make is that at some point when the fix becomes available or the vendor becomes aware of it and there's no fix or there's a workaround or a compensating control or whatever, the adjective 0 day is no longer appropriate.
Correct.
You know, I think we need more words.
But no, I agree. But Sam, I agree.
There.
I agree because there's two situations that arise, right? The vendor knows about the vulnerability, but has not yet released a patch, and then the vendor has released a patch, and so but people have just thrown the 0 day term out there. Willy-nilly doesn't matter. Like all those details we just discussed.
It's more like a stage
nothing.
in the life cycle of a vulnerability, and 0 day being the early, if not the first stage.
But I mean, even before the patch comes out, I could just throw away that device and buy another brand to get around it, and that's basically what we're all doing with Huawei.
Well,
so that's a meaningful stage when you suspect there's something wrong with it and there's no patch. That's still useful information that you might want to act on.
It doesn't change the fact that there's a vulnerability and or exploit out there that the vendor doesn't, know about. Vulnerability the vendor doesn't know about.
That's right.
And an exploit for something for which, like, an exploit for something for which there is no patch is different from someone has like documented a vulnerability that the vendor does not know about. And whether you've disclosed that in private forums or
Yeah.
public forums, it all makes a difference. And I forget the vendor. I want to say it's Sneak wrote an article about, and I've talked about it on the show, right? Like 0 day, half day, 1 day, 2 day, in an attempt to describe those different scenarios of
Right.
vulnerability disclosure, exploit development, and like where the vendor and or open source project is with first awareness of that vulnerability, and then the where in the process is that patch, right? Like, do they know about it and they're working on it, kind of thing? Have they published workarounds is yet another state. Like, yes, I know that
Yeah.
there's a vulnerability, we don't have a patch yet, I know about it, but I've published workarounds is a different state from like, this has
Right.
been published and the vendor doesn't even know about it or addressed it in any capacity, versus maybe they do know about it and they have published a patch. But a lot of the things I'm seeing in the press today are using the term 0 day when the vendor knows about it and has produced a patch, but they're still calling it a 0 day. I'm like, no, that time is past. No longer a 0 day now. Now it's just a vulnerability and an exploit, right? Vendor knows about it. They published a patch. Whether or not you applied it or not, totally up to you, right? That falls on you. Good, bad, or indifferent, it falls on you.
So
what-
by that reasoning and then default is every vulnerability posted on like a dark web forum or put out for sale on the dark web, it's a 0 day?
If the vendor is not aware of the vulnerability, but it doesn't
That's
have the
what I'm saying.
details.
But I think we don't.
But that could be a different state.
The collective
that-
we don't care until it's there's a 0 day exploit associated with the vulnerability.
But Mandy's point is like, it's an interesting scenario. There is for lack of a better term, an underground, whether that's the dark web or some kind of other form, right?
Yeah.
Someone posts and says, I have an exploit for XYZ product from XYZ vendor and it works on XYZ version, and publishes no other information. Like where now the vendor may know about it because they likely have some type of threat intelligence. In fact, I see this from multiple vendors that I track in security, network, and appliances. They'll actually publish an article like, look, our threat intelligence tells us that there is this exploit for sale for vulnerabilities in this product. Like, we're still investigating. We don't know if they actually have it or not. Like, that's just Black Lotus was a prime example of that. Someone was like, I've got an exploit that can compromise Windows systems, and like really didn't publish much else other than that. That's a different state. It's 0
That
days.
begs the question: how many vulnerabilities are discovered without an exploit?
Yeah,
Or,
I mean,
or some level of exploitation.
quite a few. I mean,
Give me.
Yeah,
Give
a
me.
lot of
there's
them.
but there's to your point, Jeff, and there's a school of thinking like if you work for a vendor whose mission is to create defensive software to aid companies in defending their infrastructure,
Right.
and you discover a vulnerability, but you don't develop an exploit, like, is that in your wheelhouse? Like, is that something you must do, should do, to develop an exploit for
I
it?
feel
to
like there
prove it?
needs to be an ontology for what
Yes,
we're talking about.
yes. So all the scenarios we described do not have great names. Hence the discussion that we're having about all the different scenarios we just, went through. 0 day is just one type of nomenclature to describe one of those scenarios. There are multiple offshoots of that scenario.
And I feel like I had a much simpler example when thinking about ontology, and that's when like Bill calls himself cool, and I go, I don't think you know.
And
what
we
that
call him
means.
Hat.
We call him Hat. Or no.
Hope you're
It's like,
listening, Bill.
I don't think that means
Cool
what you
is
think it
cool is an
means.
adjective, though. It's an adjective.
Whereas
It
Hat's
is, and hat is a noun.
Has a noun, but also in Bill's case, it's an adjective.
He
Does
hats. He hats well. What? No.
Well, that would be a
That
verb.
wouldn't be- that would be a
That would be a
verb.
verb. Yeah.
Yeah.
He does hat in that. I mean, if you
does
wanted to use it as a verb, this is the English language at its finest, right? In that
Like,
context, think of the F
Wait,
word.
wait. Before
And
we
how
have
many
an
different
ontology, we've
the
got
F
to
word can
agree
be
on
all of
what
the above.
language
It
we're
can
gonna
be
put
an
it in.
adjective, it can be a verb, it can be a
Mhm.
noun, it can it's a wonderful word in
It can
that.
be an object. It can be
In
conjunction,
that right.
junction.
Right. I
Man.
have 0 fucks to give. In that case, it's a noun. It's amazing to think about, by the way.
Hmm.
Yes.
So
Sam has
I w-
dropped. It's just
Sam's
3 of
had to
us.
drop. It's just the three of us. I want to look into defend more. I find it intriguing.
Yeah, I agree.
yeah.
But you know, I saw the article last minute, threw it in there. It's like, ooh, vocabulary, but I haven't seen what their vocabulary is.
Yeah.
And then I saw
But
that
I
it's
think we're
sponsored
coming
by
down to is
NSA.
we have a vocabulary issue in cybersecurity
Huge
that is a
vocabulary issue.
but I think it's a detriment to our community and the industry the way it is today.
I would agree with that.
No,
as well.
right? Like if we talk about malware, botnets, threat actors, vulnerabilities, exploits, there's no great ontology to any of that, and no standardization. Which is
Well,
and I think it's frustrating for. I think where we're coming to base in this conversation is it's frustrating for us.
it's frustrating, but there at least where I came from, there was a standardization. There was an InfoSec, and I assume it's still out there. I don't know when the last time it was updated. But I had somewhere behind me in a drawer, I have a hard copy, and it's dated, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s, but it has pretty much all the terminology we use today. There's some terms that have come about, more with the internet and things like that. Like I was doing the research a couple years ago during the lockdown. I was starting to look into just two-factor authentication and multi-factor authentication. And when did we switch over? And like, well, when did two-factor authentication come about as a term? And I found a bunch of early NIST documents that date back to the early 2000s. And the first time I saw two-factor authentication in print in a NIST document, I want to say it was 2004. But what I was also looking for was, if somebody says to you two-factor authentication, to spit back in terms of defining it. It's something you say it all together, something you have, something you are, or something you know. And we've had conversations with vendors, guests over the past couple of years where they introduce, well, there's more than that now. There's more capability for different factors of authentication, based on the technology, GPS and behavior and stuff like that. But, up until 20, 21, 22 years ago, the term two-factor authentication didn't exist in our nomenclature. But there's other terminologies that did exist, and they had pretty precise definitions, which seemed to be largely lost. I threw a statement up on LinkedIn, I think one day last week, because I read it in an email from a vendor, and rather than actually it was something I saw publicly, and I responded publicly on LinkedIn, but I was nice about it for change. I don't know. I guess I'm getting soft in my old age, but I did make a reference to something that they said in terms of potential vulnerability. To me, that's nails on a chalkboard. There's no such thing as a potential vulnerability. It's either a vulnerability or it's not. Is there a potential risk? Yes, that can be measured.
I
Is
think
there a
that's
potential
marketing.
threat? Yes, it's marketing.
It's marketing. They companies want to minimize the risk by calling it a potential vulnerability and could allow attackers to remotely execute code. I mean, again, this is our 20th year, and I've read a lot of these reports, and they all use that language to soften how vulnerable they are. Right? If they have a vulnerability and someone has published an exploit publicly, people have tested it and it works, it's not could allow remote exploitation. It does allow exploitation, but you never read a vulnerability description that says this vulnerability like 100% allows remote code execution to happen.
Right.
I think it's
but
rare.
The flip side is where we all started, that you get the 0 day statement. that we were talking about earlier. Because from the vendor that wants to sell the solution or the fix or the way to detect the problem, they're gonna build. It's a 0 day, which we all know is the worst possible vulnerability out there because it's a 0 day.
Yeah, yes, and it's misused. So I want to, in the last couple of minutes we have, talk about my story number 12 because I found it interesting, and I couldn't find in the article where it talks about the data set that they used. But Trend Micro analyzed an IoT botnet and published statistics. And I want to say when I first read this article, I figured out like what the total data set was based on in terms of like number of compromised hosts. Because they published statistics in the form of graphics. And if you scroll through about towards the bottom, figure 9, distribution of targeted industries outside of Japan.
Hey, look, they have a lexicon of terms in the article.
Yeah, that's good. They say statistics were calculated from mechanically verified industries of IP addresses observed in attack commands. Again, I'm not quite. I think the data set was small from when I first read this article, but in terms of like threat actors compromising devices and then launching distributed denial of service attacks, the targets were 34% telecommunications. And I think, and I'm not sure if that's compromised or like once I compromise the router, who am I targeting kind of thing.
Right.
But I think this is like the actual first compromise were telecommunications, which means it was like a home ISP, someone had a TP-Link router and someone compromised it. But since it was at an ISP of a consumer basis, therefore the attackers were targeting telecommunications. It's kind of how I read it when I first was digesting this data, right? Then they go on by industry, 14% technology, 10% hosting, 7% cloud computing, 6% banking, which is interesting. Like that tells me that in the banking industry, people are using these IoT devices. Then they go on in the next figure. Nope, not the next figure. Yes, the next figure, figure 10.
Yeah, but banking industry could be community savings and loan.
Correct. Yes, doesn't have to be large. It didn't say large financial. They just said banking, right? So they said what devices were targeted: 52% TP-Link, 20% Zixil, which I thought was interesting as well. And I'm looking at this for like, what do we need to protect as a nation, as like a vendor that potentially we could make software and to help protect these devices. What are we protecting? And IoT largely is used by consumers that aren't going to spend money on an enterprise product. But Zixil was kind of an interesting one for me. I'm like, does that mean we need to protect Zixil, who makes, they're kind of like the small, medium business kind of thing. It was just interesting to me to see how this all broke out in terms of industry as well as the devices that are being targeted in some of these campaigns. Because this isn't the only botnet that was in the news this week. That was Mitre variant targeting these devices that was used to launch other attacks.
Can you give me examples of what would be included in the others category?
Yeah,
I was saying, well, the country that has to worry the most is others, because that's 30%. Oh, wait.
Well, in terms of like brand market share, right? So that could be any other ones that were not a significant percentage. So Netgear, D-Link, whatever.
Oh, I was looking at the industries.
Oh, industries, yeah. Which is 20. Others is 23%, that's substantial, right? That's only 10% less than the top one.
Right.
Maybe they couldn't quantify it, but I think they would say that.
I mean, manufacturing isn't specifically called out here.
Industrial IoT.
Industrial, yeah.
That's not called out either.
Yeah. I'm looking at the table that shows the countries hit, and United States number 1 at 17%, and number 2 is Bahrain, and 3 is Poland, and 4 is Spain.
But then the other one,
It's
figure 11,
weird.
is country distribution of 348 devices identified by IP addresses that were part of the botnet. India's 57%. US doesn't even make the list. I want to talk to Trent about what they. There's a lot of. I have more questions than answers from
Right.
this.
There's either a
article.
lot
Yeah.
here or not.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, it's almost interesting to do some research on it and save everybody else the time, but
it was a weird one.
It's a weird article,
right? Like the
Wait,
statistics.
and why were they
just
focusing on
weird.
Japan?
Because they originated from Japan. Large-scale DDoS attacks targeting companies in Japan issued from CNC servers of an IoT botnet that has been attacking various countries globally. So maybe they were compromising routers in Japan, but using the routers in Japan to attack other countries in industries. Again, another.
I mean, what's even their source? How do they know all this?
They observations from. They say we've been continuously They say that we have been continuously monitoring large-scale DDoS attacks orchestrated by an IoT botnet, exploiting vulnerable IoT devices such as wireless routers and IP cameras.
And my question is, how are they doing that?
They don't really say.
It doesn't say, but it says they observed differences in the types of commands that were used in attacks targeting Japan. And this is just below the chart that shows the countries. They found commands such as socket and handshake were not used against Japanese targets, but stomp command was more frequently used only against Japan.
So with Japan, someone from Trend needs to come on and explain this to me.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure there's good stuff in here, I'm sure. It wasn't articulated very well. The whole picture is missing for me.
I mean, is there a conclusion? Yes. As seen in the recent botnet attacks, the use of infected devices can result in attacks crossing physical borders and causing significant damage to targeted countries or regions. It is essential to thoroughly implement IoT device security measures to avoid becoming an accomplice to such attacks. I mean, I wonder if they're going out and probing for these types of devices.
So yeah,
just like
here's the
everybody
thing.
else does.
So here's my controversial thought. By taking proactive steps to secure IoT devices, individuals and organizations can help prevent the spread of botnets and protect against potential cyber threats linked with these types of attacks. But we're not doing any of that today. What I propose is the ISPs. Let's just start here in the US. The ISPs, right? Your Verizon, AT&T, Cox Communicate. I don't know who gives you internet, Jeff, where you are.
Verizon.
Mandy, who gives you internet where you are?
Xfinity.
Right. So we've got a pretty short list, right, of companies that provide internet access. My thing is, so if the Trump administration would appoint me the cybersecurity czar of the U.S., is the first thing I would do. I'd say, look, we're going to get a bunch of money from somewhere, right? Because we always have money for these kind of, find some money somewhere, a whole bunch of money, and we're going to give it to the ISPs here in the U.S. And we're going to say, look, what I want you to do is I want you to go scan your consumers who are getting internet, and I want you to identify any devices that are end of life and have vulnerabilities, right? Your TP links, all the ones that attackers are preying upon. And then I want you to contact those people because you know who they are, right? The Verizons, the Xfinities, you could know this person because I know your IP address and I know that ties back to you, Paul. You're running this old TP link router that doesn't get any more updates. What I'm going to give you is a 50, 80%, 100% discount on a new device. You've got 90 days to respond to this thing before I start to degrade your service or turn your service off, right? Like you're not complying with our terms of service. You need to be on a device that's actually supported. We're going to give you a 80% discount on a new router. We're going to ship. They do this with their gear that they send you for like your TV and like your cable TV, right?
Mhm.
They regularly send you new gear. We're going to send you the new gear. If you need support to come do that for you, we'll dispatch a technician. It costs minimal because the government is subsidizing this program. And we're basically going to go through the ISPs to get everyone's gear updated to the latest version, right? And this should be a continuous program that gets funding to make sure that out-of-date gear that's extremely vulnerable, that's being used by nation-state threat actors to basically disrupt communications and hack into the US, we're going to get rid of all that stuff. That's how you get rid of that stuff. There has to be an incentive program. Like just saying like consumers should update their devices to the latest. No one's going to do that. No, it's like grandma and whoever that aren't in technology, they're not going to update until their ISP comes to them and says, you've got an older device, you need to update it. There needs to be an incentivized program that's funded by the government. That's my solution to that problem.
Hey, before you close out, Paul, at the very bottom of the article, they have indicators of compromise.
Yeah, I just looked at that too.
Click on that and tell me what we're looking at.
Those are SHA-256 hashes of binaries that,
and then
some
command
of
and
them,
control servers,
and then some IP addresses of command and control servers. Yep.
So does that give us a clue of how they were collecting this data?
Maybe. That means they had access. They did some incident response and did some forensics on the actual binaries that were installed on endpoint devices.
Yeah, but
Trojan.linuxmirai.au.
How does Trend Micro Research have access to any compromised devices? Or do they have partnerships with researchers and forensic companies?
Their endpoint product is installed on not the routers themselves, right? That would be shocking to me.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question. Yep. The IP address is sure.
Right.
Like the Linux Trojan that was installed on your router, how they got access to that, they obviously pulled one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And did forensics on it. And probably that's the one that came up with all those hashes.
Interesting.
And it would only take one device?
They conceivably could have pulled that from one or two devices, yeah. Maybe not one. Interesting, though.
And Jeff, why, will you...
I like how,
that work?
But my solution, I should be appointed cybersecurity czar. My solution's great. Government if we can put 500 billion or whatever, is it 500 billion into AI? Is that what we said the Trump administration
I think that's
did?
what they said.
I don't remember.
I just want like a few billion. That's all I want. A few billion. These routers are cheap. These routers are cheap, right? A few billion to ISPs, and you subsidize replacing. I mean, what do these routers cost? $50? I mean, at scale, right? $50 for a router.
Why can't we just
couple of billion buys you a lot of routers to subsidize to get to all the people that have unpatchable routers on the internet today in the US.
Why can't we just set hardware to where it self-destructs at a certain space, like at a certain time?
Well,
like light bulbs.
I mean, like light. I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, there's also like auto industry things too. Like you can't drive a car without insurance, right? Like you have to have your car but you have to have your car inspected every couple of years. And if it doesn't pass inspection, you can't drive it on the road. So this is my you're going to inspect people's devices. And if it doesn't pass inspection, you got to get a new device or you got to fix your device. And if your device isn't fixable, then you need a new one. And you just pull from Paul's Cybersecurity Act fund for ISPs. And you have a couple of $1 billion and you go get a new router. That's my solution to it all.
Let's start.
I got it all solved. I got it all. It's all good on Paul Cybersecurity czar under the Trump administration. We're all good.
Or we set up roving gangs of surly hackers that go into the houses and check their equipment.
Yeah. We scan the internet and we go raid people's houses and we pull your old fucking TP-Link routers that are vulnerable.
And here's a new one.
Get that shit off the internet. You're off the internet.
hack the providers. 'cause
Government has given you a
they have
new
inventories.
device, right? Was it Obama that gave people free cell phones? This administration, you get free routers. Free router.
Free
Now you're on the
routers for
internet.
everyone.
You're safe. You're secure. It's all
Paul
good.
Asadorian, 2028.
It's the Paul Asadorian Cybersecurity Act of 2025.
I think it's
You'll
a
have
political
roving
platform.
gangs of goons.
I'm glad we buried that at the end of this episode. And hopefully no one
Nobody's
listens to that. No one listens to that. I think it's a great idea.
All right, I think it's a great idea. We wrap up.
I agree. Thanks everyone for listening in Washington. This edition of Paul's Security Weekly. That'll do it for this episode. Over and out.